Okay, we're now recording. I'll kick this off and say thank you everyone for agreeing to participate today. I'm going to share some slides shortly that will give an idea of what we're talking about, but why don't we all start, and I'll call on people, with everyone introducing themselves. Wil, if you want to go first, followed by Tony, followed by Rob, followed by Klaus. And if you could spend a minute introducing yourself and your connection to the concept of closing the carbon cycle.
I am Wil Burns. I'm the co-executive director of the Forum for Climate Engineering Assessment at American University in Washington, D.C. And the purpose of our organization, which is a think tank, which is within the School of International Service, is to provide educational outreach on climate geoengineering options, including carbon dioxide removal options, to the academic sector, the government sector, and to the general public, and to seek to ensure full-throated public deliberations on these options and assessment.
Yeah. Well, I've studied the idea of making fuel from hydrogen and CO2, and I had a long period of making hydrogen here at the farm in bulk to use through fuel cells, and the fuel cells all failed, so I looked to produce liquid fuels, and we hit upon the idea of doing it, and it's been successful. We've run the pilot plant for 1 year and produced fuel on a 24/7 basis, 5 liters a day. My background is a soft drink manufacturer for 50 years, and then I'm a farmer still, and I was a wind turbine manufacturer. I've been a chemical manufacturer in the form of PET, polyethylene terephthalate, which I made. I made that for making bottles. I was a bottle maker, injection molder, blow molder, and a farmer, and I suppose I'm still a pilot. So that's about me.
Wonderful. Thanks, Tony. Rob, would you like to go next?
Sure. I'm an associate professor in mechanical engineering at the Colorado School of Mines. A lot of my activity surrounds fuel cells for different uses, both in electrolysis mode as well as power generation mode. Advancing new fuel cell technologies like protonic ceramics, as well as looking at older technologies, including molten carbonate. A lot of the efforts that I've been focused on are very much closely aligned with a systems perspective. Beyond that, I've also dabbled some in biomass gasification, pyrolysis activities of biomass, looking at fuel production from high temperature co-electrolysis to Fischer-Tropsch liquids, as well as synthetic natural gas production, again from a techno-economic and systems view. Most recently, a lot of my activities have been looking at means of capturing carbon and the system view associated with those kinds of challenges. Yeah, I think that about covers it.
Okay, I'm Klaus Lackner. I am the director for the Center for Negative Carbon Emissions. I have been interested for a very long time in managing the CO2 emissions, and what started me to think about it was the fact that we are not running out of carbon. We actually need carbon in the transportation sector, and we are building up a level of carbon dioxide in the air which is simply unsustainable. And the last meeting in Paris made this absolute.
Wonderful, thank you. So, and my name is Christoph Jospe, and I have been working with Klaus Lackner for almost 3 years and come from a policy background and have along the way learned a thing or two about various technologies to manage carbon. So today's conversation is going to very much be a fluid discussion. I'm going to call on some of the speakers to elaborate on some of their expertise. I'll also note that there are a number of people listening in, and I would encourage them at the end to participate in the discussion, either by typing questions into the chat box or asking questions when it's time to do that. The aim of today's discussion is really to create a dialogue and a discussion that we can make public, that people can listen to, that speak about concepts that might be under-amplified relating to closing the carbon cycle. So we're going to kick it off with Wil Burns. Wil, if you could please give us a little bit of framing as far as where the state of the climate is today, what is the political environment, and what is needed in order to reach this 1.5 degree limit as was set out in the recent COP21.
Okay, great. Thank you, Christoph. So, yes, I'd just like to set the table in terms of the exigencies that have driven the discussion for the need for direct air capture. So we start with the Framework Convention on Climate Change, of course, in 1992, which entered into force in 94, but the commitment under this convention was extremely tepid, right? It called for seeking to reduce greenhouse gas emissions back to 1990 levels by 2000. And immediately before we got to the first conference of the parties, it was incredibly clear to everyone that we weren't even going to meet that commitment. Indeed, the International Energy Agency in that year concluded that none of the parties to the OECD were likely to meet this commitment by the end of the beginning of the next century. So, and projections were that emissions have now increased by about 35% in the past few decades over 1990 levels. So in response to these trends, the parties to the Framework Convention then established the Kyoto Protocol. The good news was the protocol for the first time established binding targets and timetables for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. However, the first timetable was extremely modest in terms of what it called for, with average reductions for developed countries only to be about 5.2% below what they would have been in the period between 2008 and 2012. And as we knew this at the time and we know now, that was an extremely modest down payment. Indeed, all the projections were that developed countries were going to have to reduce their emissions by somewhere between 80 and 85% below 1990 levels to effectuate the goal at the time of scientists of holding temperature increases to below 2 degrees Celsius. A second commitment period was established under the Kyoto Protocol at the 18th Conference of the Parties, but it was still modest. It called for emissions reductions of only 18% below 1990 levels by 2020, and a number of developed countries withdrew from that second commitment period, meaning that you only have parties to the protocol that are responsible for 15% of global emissions. And so Kyoto in itself is wholly inadequate to meet the goals that we've established. So in 2015, the parties to the Framework Convention drafted the Paris Agreement, right, to establish a long-term framework to address climate change. And among its salutary provisions was an agreement to, for the first time, to establish an express objective of holding temperature increases to, quote, well below 2 degrees Celsius, and to pursue efforts at least to limit temperature increases to 1.5 degrees Celsius. It also acknowledges the need to rapidly ratchet down emissions and to seek to achieve a balance between emissions and removals by sinks by the second half of the century. At the heart of Paris are the parties' emissions reductions pledges, the so-called nationally determined contributions, or NDCs. And the good news here is that 185 countries have made these pledges, representing about 94% of emissions. And the commitments themselves, if faithfully implemented, translate into about 60 gigatons below business as usual scenarios. However, there's lots of bad news here. First of all, the NDCs merely slow the rate of growth of greenhouse gas emissions by somewhere between 10 and 57%. And while emissions are currently at about 48 gigatons carbon dioxide equivalent, the pledges of the parties, if all met, and that's a big if, would currently put us on path for emissions of roughly 55 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions by 2025 and 57 gigatons by 2030, or roughly a 45% increase above 1990 levels. And so as a consequence, recent analyses by UNEP, Climate Analytics, and the Climate Action Tracker project temperature increases of somewhere between 2.7 and 3.5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. And many people believe that even these are optimistic because a lot of these pledges are freighted with all kinds of conditions that may not occur. We may have expended about 75% of the so-called carbon budget to avoid passing the 2 degrees Celsius threshold by 2030. And so while Paris is also salutary in the sense that it provides for a stock-taking provision, which would allow parties to ratchet up the levels of their commitments, the first one of these stock takes is not until 2023. And at that point, we quite frankly need heroic reductions in emissions, somewhere between 7 and 9% annually if we're going to avoid passing the 2 degrees Celsius threshold. And that's probably both economically and politically unrealistic. And as a consequence of this, there's been increasing emphasis on the potential role of enhancing sinks to try to help us to not pass critical thresholds or to allow us to do so in a way that's the most economically efficient in terms of emissions reductions commitments in the future, or to help us in so-called overshoot scenarios where we pass the 2 degrees Celsius threshold and have to find a way to ratchet down atmospheric concentrations to move back toward 2 degrees Celsius or below this. Now, most of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change integrated assessment models in the 5th assessment report contemplate the use of sinks technologies of one sort or another. The majority of them have emphasized so-called negative emissions technologies such as bioenergy and carbon capture and sequestration. But first of all, BECCS may prove extremely problematic from a standpoint of socioeconomic justice. Even delivering 3 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent negative emissions around the world could require us to use land equivalent to 380 to 700 million hectares by the year 2100, which could translate into 7 to 25% of agricultural land, 25 to 40% of arable and permanent crop area, or 21% of total current human net primary productivity. So this could imperil food security, obviously, given the land that might be required. It could substantially raise food prices. We've seen this already in terms of the biofuels commitments made by the European Union in the period of 2007 and 2008. It could result in massive land grabs, especially from particularly vulnerable peoples in areas such as sub-Saharan Africa. And it could also have massive requirements in terms of water. Also, it's only part of the puzzle. It's clear that even if BECCS can be viable, it's going to require a portfolios requirement in terms of sinks to really meet the goals that we're talking about. One of the other major sinks enhancing options that's been discussed frequently in recent years, and indeed the only geoengineering option where there's been large-scale field testing, is so-called ocean iron fertilization, the idea of seeding the oceans or portions of the oceans with iron to stimulate phytoplankton growth, which would take up carbon dioxide. However, beyond the fact that studies increasingly indicate that this would have only a modest contribution to our goals, it's also fraught with peril. It could result in proliferation of undesirable phytoplankton species that could wreak havoc with ocean ecosystems. It could produce anoxic dead zones that could imperil ocean ecosystems, and also produce large amounts of nitrous oxide emissions that could obviate a lot of the benefits in terms of reducing carbon. And so increasingly, there's been emphasis on direct air capture, a technology that not only could be part of this so-called portfolio of sinks-enhancing technologies, but also, quite frankly, might not have some of the same undesirable characteristics of some of the other technologies that we've talked about. And so as a consequence, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, as well as a number of other climate decision-making bodies, including the Framework Convention on Climate Change, have increasingly focused on the potential viability of direct air capture, the need for research in this context, and some discussion in terms of the timing of deployment. And so I would now turn it over to the experts in this field to talk about some of the prospects in this context.
Thank you very much, Wil, and thank you for framing that in terms of the political and social context. Rob, I'm going to turn it over to you and ask you to speak a little bit about the industrial challenge, that from the systems point of view, what it means to meet the goals that are set out. And as Wil went into a number of different examples, feel free to do so and also draw on your past experience.
Okay, so I don't know if I can match Wil for statistics, so I certainly will not try. But in my view on the industrial challenges, I think obviously since there is no silver bullet, we're not talking about developing one large-scale process, not only to capture carbon, but also then if we're talking about closing the cycle, eventually you do need things like liquid fuels, which means you've got to break the CO2 apart again. And so from end to end, from capture, storage, whether it's temporary or permanent, transport, and then reusage or utilization to making chemical commodities, synthetic fuels, for example, all of that needs to be worked out. So that obviously represents tremendous challenges. And one of the things that's particularly on my mind is the energy requirements to do that. And so there's, of course, a lot of interest, a lot of talk about addressing climate change with the integration, high renewables penetration. And that, for the most part, still seems to be largely aimed at decarbonizing the electric grid, which really only represents perhaps 1/3 of the challenge when we talk about emissions. And so if you look at also trying to break CO2 apart for its reuse to completely close the cycle so that you can produce carbon-based fuels, then the energy requirements go up even further besides displacing the current installed capacities that are out there at the terawatt scale. And so just looking at it, you might almost say that energy is perhaps some of the top concerns for just trying to manage and achieve carbon balance, if you will, and as we've beginning to discuss, perhaps carbon negative emissions. And those energy requirements could possibly, depending on efficiency and so forth, double the installed capacity requirements for power generation as we see it today. Of course, the other issues from an industrial view are scale-up. To get to gigaton, there are certain technologies that perhaps are available today to get there in terms of capture and some conversion perhaps through Fischer-Tropsch processes and so forth. But there's the new technologies which will offer perhaps better pathways, although it still has to be determined, are unknown in terms of scaled performance and how to get there. And then on the utilization side, there are a whole host of systems pathways from electrochemical conversion through thermochemical and other pathways as well, photoelectrolysis and so forth, which we don't even really know the best pathway, although we certainly have attractive technologies that are, if really in the R&D scale, although there are some larger scales. So I think the scale, points then to scale up as well. How do we get there, and what paths do we take, and how are they economically viable? We might look towards some perhaps historical examples because the challenge is of course daunting, and the scales are across, as we've just discussed, you need a portfolio of technologies, but there's certainly historical examples where we might be in a low technology state, a high risk state, and achievements have been made going all the way back to the early 20th century with Haber-Bosch processes, when high pressure chemistry and high temperature reactions were in their infancy. In fact, hadn't even been done yet. In 5 years, tons of ammonia and fuel could be produced. So I think there are gleams of hope on some of the single process technologies. And of course, things like nuclear and what are we going to do with nuclear remain, and how can it fit. But in the end, I think you also look at from an industrial view, if you look at something like Haber-Bosch and how it did succeed when it was basically in the lab and then moved to large scale, what are the models or examples that make such ventures successful? And you need things like leadership, committed leadership and vision, champions, obviously policy and commitment and investment, in tight connection between R&D and industrialization for all of this to happen. And I think those challenges are just as equally daunting perhaps as some of the technical ones, but they've been done and there are examples. And so I think all of those challenges, what pathways and how do we systematically propose options, and yet at the same time incentivize the marketplace so that can be unleashed to find solutions, certainly that are not all government driven. Some examples, so if you want to make SNG, for example, in the U.S. that's really not attractive because of shale gas economically at the moment, but renewable portfolio standards in terms of renewable fuel standards are through the vehicle VINs are making renewable natural gas actually in the U.S. potentially very attractive suddenly. And so I think there are those kinds of examples which can help try to get some critical mass there in terms of the technology and the industrial challenges. At the system level, if you really want efficiency and low cost, you're going to need to begin to look at the idea of all these interconnected systems. And I think integration is a systems level challenge that looks very good on paper, and it makes a lot of sense from you look at efficiency and economics. The practical reality of integrating lots of different kinds of hardware and processes, to make syngas and then to convert it and also have power integrated and heat recovery, those integrations, are certainly a challenge, and they will require time, I think, to get right. And so that's kind of my overall broad arching view on barriers, as well as perhaps some lights of past that may certainly give us some hope for previous successes at large scale efforts.
Thank you, Robin. You brought up a number of points that I think we'll have time to unpack today. I'd like to segue into Tony and actually pick up on your remarks, because Tony has a company that is moving down the learning curve and can speak a little bit to a system that might be required to close the carbon cycle. So, Tony, take it away.
I will. Yeah, very interesting, Rob. We set out in the beginning 5 years ago to produce a carbon neutral fuel. The philosophy behind that was that if we produce carbon neutral, and if enough was produced, it would enable the Earth of its own restorative capacities in the soil and the sea to pick up the CO2 naturally if we didn't keep adding it. And one of the principal sources of adding it, of course, is power production and transportation. So we set out to make liquid fuels carbon neutral without taking any resources from the Earth apart from the initial construction of the plant and the catalysts, and without returning any waste to the Earth. And we set out to set the scene, and you raised the question of energy consumption. It is true that whenever you convert energy from one form to another, as you well know, you don't gain energy, you lose energy. Well, we are producing our fuels at a ratio of 2.2 energy in to one energy unit out. And we think that's pretty good compared to a power station of 3.5 or 4 even power in, power out. And the process, it might be interesting for you to listen to the exact process in a little more detail. We collect CO2 in a vertical tower with a very small fractional horsepower fan blowing air up the tower, and we trickle down the tower sodium hydroxide over a plastic diffuser with a diffusion pathway all down the tower. We get to the bottom, and we're mostly sodium carbonate by then, and we have at that stage, according to our CO2 meters, which we keep running at the time, we were going in at 418 ppm of CO2 at the top, and we come out at the bottom with 120 ppm of CO2 remaining. So we've removed something like 80% or 75% of the CO2. We then take the sodium carbonate and we put it through, as you mentioned, an electrolytic electrolyzer. And it's a three-stage electrolyzer. It has a CO2 release, a hydrogen release, and an oxygen release. It's a nominal voltage of 2.2 volts. And we run that and produce the separate gases. We release the hydrogen to the atmosphere because we're not big enough on the pilot plant to make any use of it. But in a large plant, it would be an industrial product, of course. We take those two gases, the CO2 separated pure, it's 99% pure, and we take the hydrogen from the water in the atmosphere, or water if we have it available, by electrolysis. And we then take a mixture of 3.1 parts of hydrogen to 1 part CO2, and we put it through mass flow meters to go into an initial electrolyzer, which is consisting of a catalytic chamber. And under pressure and temperature, which it's exothermic, it produces its own temperature, we form methanol, which is the lower end of the carbon chain. And then we have a second catalytic system, which takes methanol and turns that into gasoline, which is in the range of 10-12 carbon. And then, of course, we are going to produce, and we know how to produce, jet fuel, which is in the range of 14 to 16. So we haven't done jet fuel yet. We have done diesel. And so the whole process doesn't require anything from the Earth, and it doesn't return anything from the Earth. And
tandem launch?
I think the other point is the economics of it. You mentioned the economics.
Alchemist Stuff Accelerator?
I'm sorry, was someone else talking? Anyway, let me carry on. You mentioned the economics. Well, our initial stab at economics says that at 1,000 tons a day plant, which is our standard production plant design, we were producing fuel, a very economical figure. We're sort of in the English pound, 0.85 of a pound. I suppose you'd put that down in dollars at about 0.5 per litre. And of course, when you look at the economics compared all of us today have to think of, we're comparing it with a fossil fuel which is dug out of the ground at tremendous cost of CO2, it's transported distances, it's refined at tremendous cost, and it's very difficult to get those CO2 emissions. But what we do know is that the CO2 which is coming from the fuel is not paid for. It's a pollution of the atmosphere. And when we're competing with somebody who pollutes the atmosphere, with a process that you or we together are going to produce a plant that doesn't pollute the atmosphere, either we should get credits for what we do, or the people who pollute the atmosphere should pay debits for what they do. And that would make the economics extremely viable. I mean, it would be really jam on the cake. When you look about the amount of energy required, yes, it's true at 2.2 energy per 1 unit of energy coming out. We're confident that we'll get down to 2, but even that is double. And we looked at, for instance, in England, we need about 140,000 tons of oil a day. So if we manufacture crude oil, plastics, chemicals, fertilizers, everything, we would need an area in the North Sea of about 120 miles square of wind turbines. And we would have them as DC wind turbines, not AC wind turbines. Because for one thing, the double transmission between AC, DC, and AC again, because most of the current in synthetic fuel, as far as we're concerned, is in DC. So it would be a very economical process. And furthermore, the methanol which is produced, which is the first stage, could be used in another big advantage. The power companies that exist, whether it be fossil or renewable, do suffer peaks and troughs as far as production and use is concerned. And their peaks and troughs are very difficult for them to manage, particularly when wind and solar come into it, which is unpredictable. And of course, the demand from industry and domestic is rising and falling. And so from a power company or a distribution company's point of view, it would be very economical to just make the first stage of the process and use methanol, store the methanol in big tanks, and then when you needed a peak surplus of electricity, and then in a shortage of electricity, you to gas turbines and reproduce the power as electrical current. So many advantages in smoothing out the power curve of and the power needs. There isn't a silver bullet, and certainly as far as the aviation is concerned and shipping, they've escaped so far, but in fact they're beginning to pick up the cudgels, and I see even this week there has been a note in the aviation magazines to the effect that they have got to face up to their responsibilities, and they are going to have to seek to use more biofuels. Well, as was mentioned earlier on, the use of biofuels is a tremendous drag on the Earth's viable, cultivatable land, particularly with the sea level rises, because most of the river deltas are going to be flooded, which is a very fertile area of the planet. If we have the amount of fuel needed for the aviation industry, it would cut down, as was said, on the amount of food production that was capable. So my view personally is that synthetic fuel is an answer. It could be done in many different ways, and we're not going to be the only company that does it. But we've been producing it, as I said, for a year. And we're going to come into the US now. We've got a factory near Phoenix Airport, and we're going to start building units there for sale. But that's a little way down the line. It's maybe a year or a couple of years away. I think that gives you a better summary of where we are and how I see our development. And I honestly see the government departments are not aware of synthetic fuels. They're only aware of biofuels. And when you look at the press, they don't talk about synthetic fuels, they talk about biofuels. And I see a great disadvantage there in the land area versus food. So we have to get our point over somehow politically that there is another thing, there's a thing called synthetic fuels. And I think that probably, Christoph, does that explain what I've been trying to do for the last 5 years, and does it clear to you?
Perfectly, Tony. Thank you very much. Klaus, I'm going to pass it back to you, and I invite you to comment on any of the remarks that have already been said, but also frame this discussion a little bit more in terms of these systems to close the carbon cycle, both in terms of recycling and disposal, and ultimately the transition to a waste disposal paradigm that doesn't exist today but may need to exist in the future.
Well, thank you. Let me start, just like Will, who did an excellent job. Back in the 90s, what convinced me very early on that this is a difficult problem that requires technology solutions and a different way of looking at it was the observation that we need to get to a balanced carbon economy sooner or later. What we can argue about is the CO2 level we can tolerate or what pain levels we are willing to accept. Maybe 350.org is right, and we need to stop at 350, or should have stopped at 350. Maybe the people who say we have to go back to 280 are right, although I doubt it. On the other hand, right now, the 2-degree number is bandied about, and while most people think of this as 450, if you look at the trajectories people nowadays offer, they actually aim at 500 ppm. Tim Kruger has so nicely put this. There's an inflation going on in the level we are going to, because it becomes clearer and clearer that we can't get there. But what convinced me, and what's critical in this argument, is that the mobile carbon pool, which half of it is the atmosphere, or a large fraction of it is the atmosphere, is actually essentially closed. So as long as we take firmly sequestered carbon in form of fossil carbon out of the ground and put it in the atmosphere, roughly half of it is with us for several hundred years, and the rest of it will decay over millennia. So in effect, Susan Salomon wrote a paper some years ago where she argued that the warming effect of a ton of CO2 lasts roughly 1,000 years. It ramps up rapidly and then sits there, and you have a cancellation between CO2 gradually dissolving in the ocean and the warming of the ocean keeping up. These two things go together because heat is moving into the ocean and CO2 is. So what struck me is we really shouldn't think about this as we need to set lower and lower limits. We really need to think of the carbon dioxide as a waste product. And that changes your thinking, because if you think about Kyoto, we said we need a reduction. I can hear now we would like to have 80% removed, and maybe in the distant future we balance things. But if you think about it as a waste, it's different. If I were to tell my neighbors that I'm dumping my garbage in the street, and I really worked hard on it, and I reduced my garbage dumping by 50% because the efficiency of my household went up, I don't think they would take that as an answer. They would say, you stop dumping garbage. And I think we are dumping CO2 in the atmosphere, and we have to stop that. And you could argue we can live with a certain amount of litter, but we can't keep doing this indefinitely. I also believe that it is actually easier to convince people not to make a mess rather than saying the sky is falling and the end of the world is coming, because if you do that, people say this is just like Y2K, and you're telling me I have to change my lifestyle, I don't want to do this, therefore you're lying. On the other hand, we stopped dumping sewage because we managed to figure out that it's dangerous, but we also stopped littering the highways, and we even have a societal agreement that we penalize people for still doing it, even though you can't really make the argument that the world is coming to an end if somebody throws a Coke can out. Right? So overall, I would argue we have to start thinking about this as a waste disposal paradigm, and that implies, of course, the need for sequestration and storage. And this has been amplified by the fact that we also have already, likelihood overshot. If we really take the 1.5 degrees seriously, and we mean it, I would actually pose the question, If we manage to hold 400 ppm from here on out indefinitely constant by some trickery, I would argue it is quite likely that the ocean warming will go on for another 60, 70 years, and at the end of the day, we may very well already have breached the 1.5 degrees as this system asymptotes out to a new level. So if we want to stop CO2, we have to pull CO2 at 1.5 degree. We probably already have to pull CO2 back out of the atmosphere, and very likely we cannot stop at 450 ppm because it will take us too long, and we will have to pull out even more. So I fundamentally disagree with the moral hazard argument, which says, well, if you give that option, then people won't do anything. I would argue at this point, we already have to deploy it. The delay and the dawdling already has happened. We could have had an argument about the moral hazard in 1980. Now it's too late. We waited so long that this is our only choice to balance the books. In the discussions we had about silver bullet versus silver buckshot, I'm sort of in between. I do believe in the end there is no silver bullet. On the other hand, we engineers have to figure out some technologies which can reach the scale. And while deep down I don't believe that a single technology will take over and do it all, it's actually comforting to know that a particular technology at some inefficiency could actually get there. And I do believe that capture of CO2 from air is an absolute necessity in balancing the books. First of all, and furthermore, sequestration. If we really have to come back by 100 ppm, we give or take will have to find a home for 1,500 gigatons of pure CO2, which have to be stored somewhere, right? Because that's the amount which will have to be taken out if we endeavor to reduce the CO2 in the atmosphere by roughly 100 ppm. And I include in this, by the way, a factor of 2. Because the ocean will give back its half it has taken on. So air capture becomes a central technology in order to balance the books, in order to create negative emissions. It also allows, as Tony pointed out, but also Rob pointed out, the ability of closing the carbon cycle without actually adding fresh carbon. You take CO2 and water, both from the environment, and you convert them into hydrocarbon fuels, which then at some later time turn back into CO2 and water. So you can have a process running like this. And we have worked on air capture. I do believe it is central to have something working in a university or public environment where everybody can kick the tires, where people can see what is done, where we don't hide behind hidden things. I'm actually impressed by Tony, how well he explains, how much detail he gives, how his stuff actually works, but an open source effort there would actually be very, very useful. The way we are trying to contain energy and cost is by being passive. We are like a windmill. We let the air come to us and we extract the CO2 as it gets absorbed on surfaces. We make these surfaces loose enough that the wind can blow over them. And we have a particular sorbent which has a remarkable feature that when it's dry, it has an extremely high affinity to CO2, and it loses it when it's wet. So we can swing the material and raise the partial, concentrate CO2 roughly 500-fold simply by taking materials and swinging them between ambient dry air where the material dries out and wet where it collects, in wet where it pushes the CO2 off at a 500 times higher partial pressure. So in a way, we have these pieces there. I don't think we are limited by energy consumption. What limits us and everybody else is cost, and costs are still high, but can come down. One of the things I found very interesting is if you look at our approach or some other approaches, if you add up the energy costs we have, if you add up the raw materials which added in, you are well below $30 per ton of CO2 contributing to the cost of collecting a ton of CO2. But on the other hand, numbers have as high as $600 a ton have been bandied around by the American Physical Society because the initial processes are expensive. So it is really just like in PV, where the first processes were 100 times cheaper than before. and I would argue that there are some raw material and energy inputs you cannot rationalize away, you cannot get rid of with mass production, but I can convince myself right now that those are actually extremely cheap. Starting at $600 a ton, yes, is prohibitive from an economic perspective, but on the other hand, photovoltaics has come down by about a factor 100 over time. And so here we too have to come forward with a way of driving costs down. Furthermore, I would argue cost estimations are extremely difficult when it comes, particularly when it comes to the future. Cost estimations of future processes, to put it mildly, stink. My favorite example I stumbled in recently. It turns out right now it is cheaper to have a PV panel making electricity and use a resistor to make heat, low-grade heat, rather than buy an off-the-shelf available solar thermal heater, which tells you here are two different cultures who have settled on two different cost structures, and the PV, which is pushed hard, currently is winning, which is, from a thermodynamics perspective, has no excuse, no reason to succeed in, but it just shows how bad we are in getting costs to where they have to be, and how good we sometimes get if they are the economic drivers in place to push it. I fundamentally believe that the way to get cheaper and do it in time is a mass production route. If you think in extremely large scales, it just takes too long. If you right now want to build a gigawatt nuclear power plant, you probably take a decade to get started, and with a nuclear plant, you may not even succeed. If it's a big industrial plant which operates on that same multi-billion-dollar scale, you will find that it takes you years and years to just get started, to raise the capital, to get the permits, to build the one of the kind. If you want to be fast, you have to think like microprocessor producers, like car producers. You build small units which you can replicate very fast and put out in vast numbers. And then you can do things in a couple of decades. People have demonstrated this before. So I believe that's a likely route to go. One of the things I would put in front of Wil and other people who look at the policy issues, if this is a waste disposal issue, somebody needs to certify that we actually have put the waste away. We need to have something like a certificate of sequestration. And if you simply argue that if you want to dig up a ton of carbon and mobilize a ton of carbon, you have to prove to me that you already immobilized another ton. In other words, you have to tear up a certificate of sequestration if you want to mobilize another ton of carbon. You can get to balance. I realize you cannot do this overnight, so you could follow a route like Miles Allen has suggested, that we begin with only asking for a few percent, but gradually over time ratchet that up until it's 100%. And then you can leave it to governments and volunteers, by the way, to say we buy more certificates of sequestration and simply tear them up. So there is no way for them to be used for additional fossil fuel, and then you have negative emissions. So we could do all of that. Now I'm really at the silver buckshot, because the certificate of sequestration can work with anything. If you could even certify very different ways of putting CO2 away. By the way, if you take CO2 and convert it to nanofiber carbon, yes, you spend a lot of energy, but if you converted aluminum oxide to aluminum, you actually spend even more energy to make that happen. So yes, I could very well see us sequestering carbon in infrastructure. Probably never enough to balance the books, so therefore I'm interested in mineral carbonation, but also to close the carbon cycle, because very likely we will not end up having a transport sector which is entirely free of liquid fuels. And as Tony pointed out, that gives an enormous opportunity to introduce low-cost electricity which cannot follow demand, because now you have a flexible consumer who can turn on and off. And this, to me, means that one of the big things, another big breakthrough technology we need, is ultra-cheap electrolyzers, because they can pick up the electricity when we have surplus of it, then converted, and they have to be ultra cheap rather than ultra efficient, because most of the time they will sit idle. They can only run when the electricity is in surplus, and only the market can find out where actually this is. How all the things fit together in the end, I do not know. I can envision a world where we still use oil. I could envision a world where in the next 20, 30 years we abandon oil in favor of synthetic fuels. But for that, I need to understand costs and economics of systems. I don't fully understand, and I expect nobody understands, and the markets will have to figure it out. I think I close on this one.
Thanks, Klaus. I'd like to kick off some questions and invite anyone who's thought long and hard about liquid fuels and batteries. In California, I just read an article where they are looking to entirely electrify the fleet. Is this a good idea? And are liquid fuels going to go away?
Could I answer that, Christoph?
Go for it, Tony.
Well, yes, electric transport is an option, and it is going to improve. It's already improved hundredfold over what it was 3 or 4 years ago. And we're now having electric aircraft in the light aircraft series, which were originally running for 10 minutes, are now running for 3 hours, which is actually the conventional time of a gasoline-fueled aircraft. So, yes, the costs are coming down that Klaus was mentioning, and I agree with you, Klaus, because the biggest cost that I have in producing synthetic fuel is not the CO2, that's the lowest cost. The highest cost I have is producing hydrogen. And so when we look at fuels or the electric batteries are going to succeed, I think it's a changeover process. It's not going to happen suddenly. And if we tried to make it happen suddenly, it would drain an awful lot of CO2 into the atmosphere through making all the new goods and batteries and cars and ships that were needed. It has to be a gradual process. And the gradual process has to be at least carbon neutral, and hopefully, as Klaus said, carbon negative. If we can't get a transport fuel that's carbon negative, and I'm going to have to struggle at that, then we have to catch extra CO2, as Klaus has well done, and turn it into carbonates or rocks or whatever we decide to do. So we need to put the time balance between the change to electrics and the drift away from fossil balanced by a synthetic fuel. And if I were to be a long-term guesser of what will happen, I would say that if you looked in another 150 years' time, we wouldn't use liquid fuels at all. We'd be using electrical power. Electrical power from fusion, electrical power from fission, if the worst comes to the worst. And it's not going to happen suddenly. And what we have to gear ourselves to do as a little team, we are here at this table, we have to make some solution which is going to bridge the gap of this period. And I know that I can produce hydrogen a lot cheaper than I am producing it by electrolysis. I want to produce it using ultrasound, and I'm working on it with 2 universities in the UK now. Ultrasound has tremendous physical properties of shearing the water into huge temperatures and pressures, which will actually release the hydrogen and oxygen. The big drag with that is immediately it's released it from its bonds, it recombines, and we have to stop it. So we've hit on a method of stopping it recombining, and we have to test it from theory into practice. This is a little bit for the future. To answer the question, I think electrics are going to come. I think fuels will be phased out eventually, but it may be 50 or 100 years. And what liquid fuels there are should be synthetic. And that's the answer I would give to that question.
Thanks, Tony.
Hi, Christoph. Could I chip in? It's Tim Kruger here.
Hey, Tim.
Is that okay?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Thanks very much for setting up this webinar. I just want to pick up on a few points that people have made. So Rob made a good point about the need for there to be some sort of subsidy to make this economically viable. And I think in danger of talking about slightly different things. So Wil has talked about the need to have carbon negative technologies, and Klaus has talked about CO2 as a waste product. We need to remove it from the atmosphere. My concern is that if we're going to close the carbon cycle by taking CO2 out of the air and producing liquid hydrocarbons, the only way that that can be monetized is by oxidizing those hydrocarbons. And that releases the CO2 back into the air. So at best, that part of the process is carbon neutral. So Klaus has talked about a certificate of sequestration, and I think that makes eminent sense. But the question I have is, would the production of liquid hydrocarbons from CO2 captured from the air actually qualify for such a certificate of sequestration? Because although it would take the CO2 out of the air for a short amount of time, it would only do so until such time as that fuel is used, at which point it would go back, and then it would be carbon neutral. So I just want to try and pull that apart. So it's part comment, part question, but I'll leave it there and see what people have to say about it.
Good question. Could I try to answer this? The way I think about the certificate of sequestration, you would not get credit for air capture. You would have to sequester. And the way I would like to think about it, and I'll propose this to the group in a way, is that some agency has to be the certifier. This could be an accounting firm in the end, but ultimately there has to be some government oversight, where you can basically get a process accredited as a sequestration method if you can do two things. You can draw a box around your carbon, and you can show on a regular basis that the carbon content in your box is what you tell me it is. And how often you have to do this may depend on the process. But now you have many different options. I might come along and say, I have mineral sequestration. That's the way I store carbon. The moment I play this game, I have implicitly agreed that if I ever lose carbon, I have to surrender my certificate of sequestration and give it back. So yes, you could say that the guy who pulled CO2 out of the air can call it sequestered until it's burned again, but that's probably a waste of his time and effort. But other people will have more permanent methods to put carbon away. Right? So I would argue the benefit to the synthetic fuels is not that they garnered a certificate of sequestration, but that they didn't have to pay a certificate of sequestration when they pulled oil out of the ground. Right? So they can only get to carbon neutrality. A world where you have these certificates of sequestration may keep using fossil fuel and stay carbon neutral. It may end up abandoning the fossil fuels because the certificates of sequestration are too expensive to make it economic, and you are better off closing the carbon cycle directly. I think that's not all that unlikely. It is particularly not unlikely if governments and private individuals decide to create truly negative emissions by ripping up certificates of sequestration. Right? The moment that happens, there's not enough CO2 to go, not enough certificates of sequestration going around to allow new fossil carbon. The price of sequestration certificates will therefore stay high. A world which has decided to put 1,500 gigatons of CO2 away will never have cheap sequestration because obviously the demand for CO2 is insatiable. For CO2 sequestration is insatiable, and therefore the price will stay high. A world which decides that 500 ppm is perfectly good to live with may have very cheap sequestration technologies. Right? The price of oil in 2006 and 2007 didn't approach $150 a barrel because it was so hard to extract. It was because demand and supply were out of balance. Right? In a world where we have committed ourselves to pull 100 ppm back, supply and demand are for the next 50 years out of balance. Right? So therefore, I would argue that in a world like that, you have a very high likelihood that fossil carbon is being abandoned in a world in which we don't feel it necessary to come back down, we very likely have cheap certificates of sequestration. And then it's not so clear to me that the petroleum-based gasoline couldn't compete with a synthetic gasoline, right? And I don't know the answer up front, but I would argue the air capture cost drops out of this argument because they share that, right? In one case, you needed the air capture to get back into the ground. In the other case, you needed it to close the cycle. So the question is, how does the electricity cost up front compare with just sucking oil out of the ground? And right now, I have a very rough rule of thumb. There are roughly 40 kilowatt hours in a gallon of gas. And I think Tony is right. An optimistic approach is to say we roughly get 50% efficient. So I need 80 kilowatt hours of electric energy input to make 1 gallon of gasoline. At 2 cents a kilowatt hour, that's $1.60. By the way, $100 per ton of CO2 would say the carbon cost added into that CO2 was 85 cents. So it's half of it. So he's absolutely right. The dominant cost is on the electricity consumption side. And if you limit that price to 2 cents a kilowatt hour, you are limited to a small fraction of the time of the day when electricity prices are actually low enough, when the wind and solar produces enough to depress prices. But I would argue you have a commodity here where maybe your levelized cost has to be 5, 6 cents a kilowatt hour in the future, and some part of the time you get 8 or 9 or 10 cents, and some other part of the time you can the only guys who are buying are willing to keep the price up are those who make fuels, and they would jump in at 2 cents a kilowatt hour. So I could see a world like this, but it's very hard to predict where exactly we come out. But I 100% agree with you, the certificate of sequestration didn't do it. To Tony's point, I actually have an opposite view. I believe that we could run the transportation sector more or less on electricity. Heavy trucks and airplanes may or may not be an exception. But assume we have succeeded in this, and somebody comes along and says, look, if you take 2/3 of the batteries out of this car and replace it with a small methanol-based generator, you actually do much better as far as the car goes. You suddenly have a 2,000-mile range, and you lowered the weight of the car. So this is all good. So I would argue there are intrinsic advantages in liquid fuels. And one of the intrinsic advantages is they didn't carry the oxygen, right? So they actually gather mass while they drive along, and the battery can't do that. They gather the oxygen, which is more than the weight of the carbon, right? And they spit out their combustion products, whereas the battery has to hold on to all of these things. So even in the best of worlds, the battery is, as a storage container, 10 times more massive, and in practice it's 100 times more massive than a storage container for chemical fuels. So I think there's an intrinsic advantage in keeping them, but that intrinsic advantage is balanced by the downside of having to capture the CO2 back. And therefore the cost of that is pivotal in that argument. If it's cheap enough, I think liquid fuels won't go away. In a way, air capture, if it competes with any other technology, it competes with batteries.
I think you made a very good point, Klaus. This is Tony, yeah. You made a very good point a little while back, Klaus, about the use of CO2 and the carbon as opposed to just putting it in the ground and burying it, well, but with whatever means of utilizing it in carbon manufacture of aircraft, of cars, of equipment, of machinery. It could be that, you know, the takeover of carbon as the principal strength item of building equipment and transportation and machinery, it could replace steel and aluminium. And it could be that actually the world demands a supply of carbon, demands a supply to make the things they want to do. And we are now in a supply position of supplying carbon to them. And even if we built a plant which had the CO2 collection as your system, Klaus, or as my system, or some other system, it doesn't matter. And there will be people starting with other ideas, and let them come on board because we need them. And then these people are going to be able to open up a new industry. It is the industry of supplying carbon to the manufacturing industry. We are a new process.
And to Tim, the bridge made out of carbon fiber, the suspension bridge made out of nanostructured carbon, I would suggest could add a certificate of sequestration to itself, with the understanding that at some point in the future, when the bridge is torn down, it has to give them back. Right? But then presumably something else is built. So on the other hand, keep in mind the amount of carbon you would have to store in the reservoir is fantastically large. If we really come back 100 ppm, you are talking about 150 tons of carbon per person on the planet for a future world population of 10 billion people. Right? That's 40 tons of pure carbon per person. Now I checked it, we over the century in the US put up 90 tons of concrete per person. So at the extreme end, you could see us getting there, but I would argue the likelihood that we balance the books without true disposal in a waste dump is probably not feasible unless we decide to live with the carbon which is already in the air and it will be put into the air in the next 50 years. Again, climate models notwithstanding, we don't really know what people will tolerate. Right? Once New Orleans is underwater, that's a one-time loss. Once that loss has been done, people may not be all that keen to fix it. And besides, I don't think it's fixable. And that's another thing to keep in mind when it comes to the moral hazard. Air capture, which may bring the CO2 back down, will not reverse the irreversible damage. It will not unmelt glaciers, and it will not instantly cool the planet.
If you also look, though, you know, there's a tendency, I think, to think of these things, these systems, if you will, as steady state. There's very little that's steady state about having infrastructure that's largely driven by renewable resources to provide us with the electrons to drive a lot of these processes, whether it's to capture carbon, whether it's to compress it and store it, or whether it's to rip it apart again so you can make syn fuels. And as you mentioned, you don't have the balance of if you capture the emissions you wish to capture, you don't have the demand side for carbon that's equal in terms of making synthetic fuels and chemical commodities. And I think there are certainly big questions about how to handle the dynamics that would be required when you drive many of these systems by variable renewable energy sources. And that also then complicates the economics because many of the plants, large or small, are driven by capacity factor as well, and you will get fairly significant fuel costs depending on how well your plants are loaded. Not to mention the technical challenge, even if you have cheap electrolysis, it has to be dynamically responsive. And certainly there's a lot of work both in batteries as well as ceramic electrochemical devices which point to you know, the need to have lower average current density, you know, reduces their degradation, for example. And during dynamic changes, you know, if you can maintain certain temperatures and conditions and so forth, that would be good. But there's a lot of open questions, even if you have the vision of driving a lot of these with variable renewable resources, both on the economic side as well as the technical side.
I think part of this is driven by, I was at a meeting where this sort of became clear to me. We have deeply ingrained in our thinking that electricity is on top of the totem pole, and everything else is a deterioration of that pure entropy-free source of energy. And that is true, except that electricity is perishable. And so if you don't need it, it's worthless. And I always give this as an example where I turn it around by turning the boundary conditions around. I tell you there's an island we discovered where on one side the two beaches have a 10-volt difference intermittently. But whenever they have that, I can draw any current I like. We would figure out how to do something useful with this energy. And I think we have to start thinking about windmills and photovoltaic panels exactly like that, right? They make electricity whenever they want, not when we want it. And we have to figure out how to harness it at any given moment, because otherwise we're wasting it, right? And so we have to come up with technologies which can jump in and jump off. And yes, we haven't thought that way, and yes, we haven't done that yet. And it also doesn't end up necessarily in hydrocarbons. So I could very well imagine that the first thing is you make hydrogen and you sit on it for a few hours, and then your fuel production runs its own intermittent cycle with the air capture technology, and which is a different rhythm. And then other parts of the system run 24/7 because that's what they are good at, right? But we are entering into a new regime where things look entirely different than they did in the past. And I'm actually somewhat frustrated when you read the scientific literature. You think the problem is fancy catalysts and fancy technologies to make this and that happen, whereas I really think it's about systems. We can do all the bits and pieces, and yes, we can learn how to do them 10% better. But what we really need to do is come up with a different way of thinking about systems than we have in the past. Right? We have this big scale utility chemical plant model, and they, by the way, are completely separate. And in this new world, all of this gets interconnected, and the Internet of Things will play a much, much bigger role than it did in the past. And we haven't figured out how to make this happen.
I think what's also interesting, though, if you look at electrochemical devices, they don't really want to run in the steady state in terms of from a degradation and durability view, degradation 24/7 necessarily. If there could be a good match, you know, from a technology viewpoint with the variability of renewables, provided we figure out how best to do that.
I give you another example I have one of my students look at. If you are running a fuel cell to make electricity or an electrolyzer to consume electricity, sometimes the electricity is so valuable that I take the degradation. Right? If currently you are paying 45 cents per kilowatt hour, I'm not worried about degrading my cell. I pay for it, right? Because I'm trying to maximize my profit. Right? Sure. Whereas if the price is just 1% higher than my input costs, I'm going to be very gentle about it.
I'd like to come back on a couple of points that have been made, is Tony. One is that the supply of electrical current from renewable sources is variable, there's no doubt about that. The way we've planned it in our business is to install the renewable energy capacity at 3 times the capacity we need, because if you take wind or sun, and the sun is day or night, and you take the whole average mix, it's a ratio 1/3 of the installed capacity gets delivered on a 100% basis, and you cover that with, in our case, we cover that with compressed gas storage of CO2 and compressed gas storage of hydrogen, so that the fuel plant would run 24/7, and the variables would put input into the storage tanks whenever they could and however they could. And the other point that came up is, when we talk, Klaus, about landfill, if the synthetic fuel is eventually made, and if we then start producing plastics and fertilizers, plastics which would go into soft drink bottles or to packaging or material, food plastic as a packing material, and they went into landfill, these plastics that go into landfill are a perfect sequestration of CO2, I would think, for eternity, really. And so then the other point was that in Europe we have considered a pan-European grid, electrical grid, which is fed from these solar panels in the Sahara to the wave and wind conditions up in the north of Europe. And this pan-European grid would be the starting point of the electricity source for the whole of the area eventually. But initially it would be supplying the industries in a completely closed circuit that need this current. Now, it hasn't gone ahead just yet because of money, but it is a good idea, and it's one which would actually work. So don't forget, when we put stuff in the landfill as plastics, we actually sequester it very well.
And my argument with a certificate of sequestration is, if you are right about this, which I think you are, you can now turn around and say, I would like this particular process accredited, you're looking for a different word than certified, as a certificate, as a sequestration method. So somebody would have to look it over and say, can you show me that it's still there in 10 years? Could we at any given time come back and check? The answer is probably yes. The next part then is, how often do you think we have to do that to be reasonable? And you could say, in the beginning, every 20 years, and then later on, it can get longer. Now you have a certificate of sequestration, and you committed yourself that if in 20 years it's not there, you have to give your certificate back, which probably means you have to buy a new one because you sold the other one a long time ago. But it would balance the books, and if you lost it, well, that's the risk you took. And then you can make a rational business decision whether it was worth it. But it comes down to what Rob and Tim said. There has to be an incentive to make this happen. I think we all would like that the novelty of these new methods is so great that we forget about fossil fuels. I think one thing we shouldn't underestimate, the more pressure there is on solving the climate change problem, the more credible this becomes, the cheaper oil, coal, and gas will be, because nobody will want them, right? And so we have to figure out how to live in a world of declining oil prices if we want to solve this problem. It's not, current parity is not solving your problem.
So,
thanks, Klaus. I'd just like to call on Wil here for a second, because we've spoken a lot about the technical challenges and brushed a little bit in terms of how to do it. But Wil, could you comment on the legal and social issues that might need to be in place in order to enable this paradigm? I'm not sure if we lost him. Rob.
I hear you.
Yeah, sorry, Rob.
Well, you.
Pardon me?
Yeah, go for it, Rob.
oh,
I think Will's on now.
oh
Will?
hello? Yes. So a couple of things here. I think beyond the scientific issues, some of the social and legal issues I think are going to be really important. I agree with Klaus that it is not unlikely that there will not be a substantial portion of the carbon dioxide that will ultimately have to be sequestered, even with some of the more optimistic assessments of alternative uses for the carbon. And one of the serious issues in that context is educating the public to accept the risks associated with sequestration of carbon. One of the things that we've seen in Europe in the last couple of years in places like Germany and the Netherlands, for example, have been substantial resistance to CCS projects in several areas, and some of these projects, pilot projects, have just been scrapped as a result of the political backlash. And so I think one of the things that needs to be done in parallel with the scientific development of direct air capture or some of these other approaches such as BECS is engaging the public in talking about how risks can be assessed, how risks can be reduced, and how risks can be compared between these approaches and business as usual scenarios or alternative approaches to either sequester carbon dioxide or to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And given the lead time for some of these technologies, probably starting that discussion sooner rather than later would make some sense if we're going to engender public support and political support. I also think that Paris's provisions for monitoring, reporting, and verification of responses to reducing greenhouse gases provides a framework to operationalize Klaus's approach in a way that did not exist prior to that. And its emphasis on uniformity in terms of reporting especially, and its call for enhanced and long-term monitoring could facilitate the kind of system that he envisions in a way that didn't exist before. But again, there's a need to start communicating with policymakers in that context in terms of what that system would look like and how we'd integrate it into our mitigation responses to date.
I think it's important that storage and sequestration is more than just geological injection into reservoirs. The discussion seems to have pushed it that way. And as you get more options and they start competing, you actually will more likely succeed. And it may very well be that geological storage is in the long term the winner.
That's right.
Well, you're right, Klaus, because you mentioned bridges being replaced with carbon graphene. It would be infinitely stronger. It wouldn't require painting. It wouldn't have a waste problem. It's permanently sequestered in a bridge or whatever we decide to do with it. And all these opportunities are going to come as we get experience and we get more companies coming in to join the little band of us that are trying to push this process forward and make it become a viable opportunity. And I think it was at the last meeting we had, Klaus, that you made a big point about the raw materials, and that went into my little novel, that we are a raw material supplier as well as being a sequesterer. And the raw material supplier would be a permanent sequestration. And I think we need to get that message out into government circles and the lawyers and the legislators who draw up the rules that we are somehow different and they have to take account of us.
But I think what you see is policy cannot move forward because the technology is considered uncertain, and the technology cannot improve because there's no policy driver. And we have to somehow jump that gap.
So can I just jump in here and see what we can do to jump that gap? And Klaus, I know you're coming to a meeting that we're holding in Oxford on the 23rd of September, yes. Which is going to be looking at the incentives for taking carbon out of the atmosphere. And one of the things that we're going to be reflecting on is a system that is already in place in the European Union, which is called the Waste Directive, which covers things like waste paper and batteries and electronic equipment, which mandates that the producers of those waste products, pollutants, are responsible for removing a proportion of what has been produced. And although they don't have to do it themselves, they get other people to do it, and they get a certificate of recycling or retirement of those materials.
Certificate of sequestration.
Or a certificate of sequestration is how you'd work it with carbon dioxide. So we're going to have some people who are already working with that legislative framework and seeing if we can extend that to carbon dioxide. Now, obviously, we're not going to come to a conclusion on the day, but I think it should be a useful conversation to have there. So I look forward to Klaus being there, and I take this opportunity to extend the invitation to the participants at this meeting. And I'll follow up with Christoph afterwards to see if I can get email addresses to encourage people to attend.
While we are at this, we are having a few days later, Christoph can give the exact date, conference here in Phoenix, which aims more at making fuels. And in part, this is because historically we worked with DTU, and that's their interest. But in part, it's also because I believe part of what makes our life so difficult is that we are painted in a corner where we, the handmaidens of the evil oil companies and coal companies, and simply by pointing out that the technologies we push forward are there to close the carbon cycle and actually give a fantastic opportunity to intermittent renewable energy resources, could give us a little more purchase in moving forward. So the problem you have, well, people snickered because there's a company here in town called Waste Management. I think they are now headquarters here, that they actually sponsor a golf tournament, and people don't like the idea of a waste management golf tournament. But the problem is the appeal of a waste management technology is just not very high. So you need to figure out how to embed it into a larger vision, which is more than just waste management, where you actually make valuable products, all the way from that carbon fiber-based bridge to liquid fuels, where you can say we have an opportunity to get off fossil carbon, and by the way, eventually we will have to. The question is only when. And it seems to me offering opportunities here makes things great, and I think we should see, that's the purpose of that conference, is to figure out that aspect of closing the carbon cycle, where we go to, where at best we can get to zero. And I will point out at the meeting that we also need the negative part, but overall, I would like to advertise that we can also be constructive in a new positive infrastructure which delivers value rather than just disposes of waste, which of course in its own way is a value proposition.
Thank you, Klaus. We're going to stay on time and wrap this webinar up. I'd like to thank everyone for participating. This is the first one of these of this type that we've done. I think there's ample room for more discussions, and this will be posted online as an audio file. And I encourage anyone who participated to share it with their respective networks. So
it's
thanks
actually
again.
A very carbon effective way of having a meeting.
Thanks for the opportunity to participate.
Yes.
Enjoyed it. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I've
Thank you.
enjoyed it.
Goodbye.